Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Schaeffer. I am a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre based in Washington, D.C. This is the Transform Europe Debrief, a conversation series with leading experts on environmental policy in Europe and the United States. And as Europe at the supranational level has made commitments to fighting climate change with CO2 reduction goals, individual European nations have followed suit. Green parties have risen as climate change and energy independence are more relevant in politics than ever before. But also the far right has made gains, and far right politicians have often adapted their standard anti-immigrant rhetoric to include attacks on green initiatives. To discuss the correlation, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Niels Redeker, Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Centre. Dr. Redeker is responsible for the Centre's think tank work on European economic policy. And recently, he and his team led a survey of more than 15,000 potential voters across Poland, Germany, and France ahead of the EU parliamentary elections last month, which sought to answer if the popular narrative of a greenlash or backlash to green policies is actually reflected in voters' priorities. Welcome, Niels.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
So, first, can you just tell us a little bit about your research? What did your report show? And are concerns over a widespread greenlash exaggerated or not?
Right. So what motivated us to do this research, as you just outlined, that in the run-up to the European election, there was this widespread narrative about a rising popular opposition against climate policies, right? And we saw this in the media coverage of the elections. We also saw it to a certain extent in party manifestos of European parties and in the final rows of the outgoing European Parliament. What we were curious about was whether we would also see this in the data. So is it actually the case that voters in Europe are fed up with climate policies and are turning towards policymakers that offer to hit the pause or scale down climate ambitions? This is why we surveyed respondents in, as you said, in Germany, France, and Poland. On the one hand, on their general stance toward climate policy, but then second, also on the specific policy trade-offs they see, what kind of climate policies they would support, which one they would oppose to, right? And the nice thing about this survey is that given the large sample size, as you mentioned, 15,000 people in 3 countries, it allows us to not just study the average of the population in these 3 countries, but to really zoom into the preferences of specific groups of voters. And that's often politically even more interesting, right? So we can talk about the details of the study in the whole interview. But to answer your first questions, yes, I think based on this data, we would argue that the notion of a greenlash, a broad popular backlash against climate policy is overblown, right? The majority of voters in all 3 countries is still very much concerned about climate change. It does not think that climate policy is currently risking their jobs, and would support policymakers to implement policies that are more ambitious to fight climate change. So based on this, we would think that there is really no empirical grounding of this broad analysis of backlash.
And so how is this explained in light of the EU election results, which did ultimately show an increase in the far right across Europe? Was there any kind of correlation, or is this success of right-wing parties maybe due to other issues?
No, I think so. 2 things here. The first is that what we did see, and that's in our study, but also in many other studies as well, is that climate change or climate policy did not play as much of an important role in these elections as it did in especially 2019, right? In 2019, in many countries, climate policy in the European elections was the main topic people thought about. And if you look into data, what are the priorities people attach to, like what policymakers should focus on, climate policy really ranked on top in many member states. And this was not the case this time. It was still up there, but only on many surveys rank 5, 6, 7, and other priorities were on top. And this is not that much of a surprise, right? Simply because in between now and 2019, we had a pandemic, we had a war in Ukraine, we had an energy crisis, big inflation. So naturally, other issues are voters' minds when they cast their ballot. This time than it was 2019 or 5 years ago. But we shouldn't conflate this with a shift in position, right? There's something else, like not caring that much about climate policy is something else than being opposed to climate policy. And I think sometimes these two things get mixed up. So that's the first one. So other issues ranked more highly on the political agenda this time. And the second is that, of course, we saw an increase in right-wing parties in the elections. I think we have to be a bit careful to paint a very broad picture across these 27 member states, because in the end what we had is 27 different national elections. Some of them, especially France and Germany, really saw an increase in right-wing parties. For example, in the Nordic countries, populist parties were less successful, and their green parties did better than the last election. So it's a bit hard to make a general statement. But in many member states, there is a sizable minority that is opposed to climate policy. And that's especially those versions of right-wing populist parties that you mentioned. But, and I think this is also important, if we look into the data that we have collected, it's about 30% in Germany, 30% in Poland, 23% in France, that say that climate policies have gone too far. And if we compare this data from today with earlier surveys from 2021 and 2022, we do not see a big shift or a big increase in numbers there. So there is more of a consolidation of people that are skeptical about climate policy. It's a minority, but it's a sizable one. But it has not grown that much in recent years, contrary to the narrative that we are trying to study in this paper.
You argue that the evidence of a widespread greenlash among voters is thin, but the results from each country, they're markedly different from what I could see from your research. So, for example, because France already sought energy independence via nuclear in the 70s, the question of Russia and energy independence doesn't seem to be quite as central of a role for French voters as it might be for German or Polish voters. And meanwhile, the far-right AfD here in Germany has promoted negotiations with Russia and limited armament for Ukraine while attacking green policies as expensive burdens in an escalating energy crisis. And then comparing even that with Poland, where skepticism of Russia and distrust of Russia and support for Ukraine is so deep and so widespread that even far-right parties like Law and Justice, when they were in power, would not be inclined to dismiss the importance of energy independence from Russia. So how does each country's attitude towards Russia factor into an overall picture of greenlash for you in your research?
So you are completely right? In many of the parties that are important in the countries we study, right-wing populist parties are at the same time very skeptical about climate policy and then also opposed towards supporting Ukraine, or are at least open with cooperation with Russia. I should say, however, that this is nothing that we study specifically in our paper, right? So we don't have the data to look into how people how attitudes towards climate policy correlate with attitudes towards the war in Ukraine or independence from Russia. But I can say two things that I think come out of our research. The first is that, of course, the domestic energy mix matters for people's preferences, right? So, for example, if we look into the French data, then voters are much less opposed against policies that would increase the carbon price on energy produced from gas and coal, or banning the usage of energy, of gas and oil in energy-intensive industries. Then they are opposed in Germany and Poland. And that is probably because of the fact that voters in France are aware that they have a substantial nuclear energy infrastructure, and so they depend less on these energy sources. So clearly, domestic context matters, and that is one of the things that makes things in Europe more complicated. The second thing is that geoeconomic dependence or risk still is on voters' minds. So when we asked voters what the priority of an EU-level instrument to fight climate change should be, then reducing economic dependencies on countries like China is on top of voters' minds in France and in Germany, but also in Poland. And this is especially true for voters of conservative and liberal parties, but also holds for social democrat and green voters, social democratic and green voters. And this is something that really surprised us, right? So for example, my hunch would have been that this discourse about economic resilience and geoeconomic risk is really an expert topic still in Europe, but it seems to be very much on the mind of voters, and voters are drawn to a framing of climate policy that also argues that it is a solution to risky dependencies from foreign countries.
And what policies in particular seem to resonate most with voters? So, I mean, I did notice that despite the differences in each country, it did appear that there were some priorities that were shared. So in France and Poland, I noticed that a transition to green heating systems in public buildings topped the list for popular policy preferences. But then this was predictably much lower in Germany, which probably speaks to the heat pump scandal last year with Habeck, when the Green minister attempted to create a law mandating heat pumps, which was met with widespread backlash. But also a ban on cars with combustion engines is unpopular across the board. So what are the ways in which policies are popular and shared and unpopular and shared?
You're completely right. There are some country-specific differences in policy preferences that reflect probably domestic discourse to a certain extent. But I would really stress that the pattern across the three countries is quite stable when it comes to what policies are liked and disliked. And generally speaking, we can roughly divide the electorate or the voters in Germany, France, and Poland into three groups, right? There's the first group of voters, and these are supporters of green parties, social democratic parties, left parties that are basically in favor of all kinds of climate policies. And if the alternative is to stick with the status quo or do nothing in addition, then they always take the climate policy, no matter the specifics, right? That's the first group of voters. Then the opposite holds for a second group of voters, that's supporters of far-right parties. So Rassemblement National in France, AfD in Germany. They are skeptical about almost any kind of climate policy. No matter what specifically we propose to them, if the alternative is to just do nothing or stick with what has already been decided, then they always take the status quo, right? It's very hard to find a specific policy to convince far-right voters of climate action. So basically, we have two groups of voters that are politically less relevant because some of them support all kinds of climate policy and the others almost support none of them. Who's really important are these pivotal voters in the middle of conservative parties and liberal parties. We label them climate policy swing voters because they support some climate policies, especially green infrastructure investments in electricity grids, renewable energy, public transport, but also things like industrial policy, subsidies for clean tech manufacturing in Europe, or support for decarbonizing the industry. They also are in favor of narrow regulatory measures, for example, banning private jet flights, but also like implementing green standards for industry and energy production. So there are a couple of policies that they would favor in all three countries. What they are opposed to is, on the one hand, broad regulatory measures that affect them in their everyday life, and that's, for example, the ban on combustion engines that you just mentioned, but also carbon pricing. They are very skeptical of carbon pricing in basically all sectors. And often then, if that is the measure, they would prefer sticking to the status quo. So in the end, I think what is needed, if you think about, okay, we want to build a sustainable coalition going forward in support of climate policy in Europe, is two things. The first is a stronger focus on investment and green industrial policy that is able to be attractive for middle of the road voters on climate. And second, to find ways to make unpopular but necessary climate policies, especially in the area of transport and housing, more popular, reduce opposition towards them, right? And for example, we find that in the case of carbon pricing, compensating or implementing or redistributing the revenues of an emission trading system in a progressive manner would increase support for these policies, even amongst conservative voters. So I think these are the two things. First of all, focus on the stuff that is liked across parties: infrastructure, green industrial policy, narrow regulatory things. And then second, really think hard about, if you do unpopular stuff, how to make it digestible for voters.
So, I mean, giving back kind of redistribution of climate subsidies, this is being discussed in Germany as Klimageld, for example. What other ways could this appeal to everyday voters, and what is really successful in terms of reaching these climate swing voters?
So when it comes to carbon pricing, two things are relevant. The first is that we do find that voters are skeptical about using the revenues of an emission trading system simply for climate investments. So this is something that we would have expected to be more popular, to just take revenues from the carbon pricing system in Europe and then fund support measures for industry to decarbonize. It's less liked in all three countries. What is liked is, as you say, redistribution, but interestingly, in a progressive manner. So the Klimageld in Germany, which would basically say, like, there's a lump sum that every household gets, is surprisingly unpopular, even among high-income voters. What is popular is like progressive elements. So giving low-income households more of these revenues than medium or high-income households. So this is, I think, one of the and you can probably try to generalize that more broadly in saying that if you implement policies that are costly, voters are keenly aware of the fact that some households are more affected by these policies than others, and you need to find ways to spread the burden fairly, especially amongst low-income voters. That is something that has been discussed in Europe, the social climate fund. But I think there's still a long way to go to really finding the solution for that.
It sounds like what you're talking about is that people are interested in progressive investment in infrastructure, in progressive policies, and what's lacking here is funding. What would be a way that policymakers could approach consistent and dedicated funding that would please these climate swing voters?
Right, and this is you're really pointing towards a core dilemma of our findings, right? A lot of the efficient and costless policies like carbon pricing are very unpopular, and a lot of the popular policies are extremely costly. So the big question is where to get the money from to finance them, right? And now if we look into voter preferences, there are two findings. First of all, especially in Germany, there's surprisingly little opposition towards raising government debt in order to finance these kinds of climate investments. Given like Germany's history on like a clear adherence to the black zero and a balanced budget, we would have assumed or expected more opposition towards additional government debt. But amongst the three countries, German voters are most open to additional debt in order to finance climate investment. In France and Poland, what is the most light option here is to not to raise taxes to finance investments, but to find some way of restructuring existing expenditures by government. So spending cuts in other areas like welfare or defense, I think is what we have in the question, is quite popular amongst these voters. But it really shows you a bit of a dilemma here, right? So we need to find ways of financing these investments. Raising taxes to do so is, at least if you formulate it in a way that is very broad and says, well, like income tax increases without specifying who specifically would be hit by that, is quite unpopular. That is an option, more often an option in some countries than in other countries. But we also probably then need to think about, okay, where are areas where new revenues can come from, like especially at the EU level. And then we talk about on the next European budget, which I think is going to be crucial for some of these investments, especially at the EU level.
So when it comes to creating consensus on climate change, because cooperation across the EU is necessary for creating a cohesive approach, what will the role with the new EU Parliament play? So it's shifted further to the right, but Ursula von der Leyen was reelected. So do you think that von der Leyen will bring continuity to the EU Parliament when it comes to climate change? And how do you think she might deal with the increased right-wing contingent that might block some consensus-based approaches to climate change policy?
Right. So the first thing that is important is that von der Leyen was re-elected, and she was re-elected by a coalition of the mainstream Conservative Party, the Liberals, the Social Democrats, and the Green Party. Right. So in that sense, the coalition that got her now into office is by and large supportive of the Green Deal. And you could really see this in the political guideline that she just published 2 weeks ago, where like there is no announcement of a big pause on regulation or scaling back some of the climate regulation that were enacted in the last legislation. Instead, there's a recommitment to the emission reduction target of 90% by 2040, and the Green Deal is still in there. So if you look at this, then you could think, okay, probably there's going to be more continuity than we expected during the campaign. But I think there are 3 things that we should really look out to. The first one is that there is a shift from like legislation and regulation towards investment industrial policy in her speech as well, right? For example, she announced a clean industrial deal that she wants to put forward as basically the follow-up to the Green Deal in the first 100 days of the next commission. And it's a big question, as we just discussed, right? Where's the money going to come from? What specifically is this going to look like? How could this kind of industrial policy work at the EU level? That's, I think, and there is the option just like this is going to be result in lots of empty promises, right? So that's the first thing. The second point is that a lot will depend on on von der Leyen's party in the European Parliament. The European People's Party is the largest political group, and what is different from the previous cycle is that now there's no majority without the EPP. The EPP now really is a kingmaker, and it's their position is depending on what way they want to go. They can either side with the Greens, the Social Democrats, and Renew to continue climate ambitions, but they could also build a majority with the right-wing forces in the European Parliament, or the far-right forces in the European Parliament, to dilute climate action. And I think in the campaigns, the EPP was very kept its options open on both sides, and we will have to see whether now after electing von der Leyen in the legislative work, what the coalition is going to be. So a lot will depend on how the EPP interprets what voters want. And the third, and I think this is always the case, of course, the council matters hugely. In the end, a lot of the implementation stuff will need to happen in the member states. So we will need to wait and see, if things like the fact that Germany, now the Greens really lost during the elections, France, the right-wing shift, and then the basically electoral mess that followed, is going to be important to look out for in terms of climate policies. So the council is a bit of the unknown factor here. So we will have to wait and see. But I think for now, nothing is decided. There's not a big political shift away from climate, and really depends on how the political actors that are now in charge interpret the mandate that came out of the elections in the next years.
And I also just wanted to shift and talk about some of the countries that weren't specifically mentioned or studied in your study, but that are still nevertheless very relevant and important. So in a lot of Central and Eastern European countries that were not featured in your research, so countries other than Poland, often you'll hear that the need for energy is more immediate and the funding for new infrastructure is even more limited than in Western European countries. So there's an enormous pressure to adhere to EU standards while also addressing the economic reality in their countries that widespread climate infrastructure is just a near impossible task. So is there a greenlash against climate policies, which may already be thin, or could it be perhaps framed rather as resistance to EU standards that countries may find impossible to match?
Right. I think that you make an important point there, right? That the costs of the climate transition are not equal across all member states, right? And especially in Eastern Europe, we have on the one hand like a bigger issue with energy poverty, a lot of the Eastern European member states. At the same time, an industry that is more focused on or like this is more dependent on fossil fuels than it is in many Nordic and Western European countries. So that is an issue. I cannot say specifically, like based on the fact that we don't have the data for it, whether like the pattern there looks completely different, right? Interestingly, what we found in our study is that at least in the 3 countries that we have data on, these kinds of material factors are less relevant for policy preferences, right? We don't find a systematic link between people's income, sector of employment, household situation, and their preferences toward climate policy. It seems to be very much driven by partisanship, by ideological factors, and not so much by these material underlying things. But still, from a policy perspective, right, it's of course an issue in how to deal with that. And we have a couple of things that can help there, right? For example, cohesion policy at the EU level provides a lot of funds that can also go into these kinds of investments in Eastern Europe. We have the now already mentioned social climate fund that will redistribute parts of the revenues from the emission trading system for housing and transport towards Eastern European member states. But still, probably this is not going to be enough, right? So a big question going forward is really how to make the necessary funds available to ensure that these investments are possible and that they do not overburden especially poorer member states. But I would say that still, like the infrastructure policy-wise at the EU level to support these countries is already there. A couple of funds. The big question is, are they big enough, and what kinds of financing they will get in the next budget period? But like the infrastructure there, the infrastructure is there. The problem is addressed. The question is it addressed enough?
And so just to close out this conversation, I wanted to bring it back to cooperation across the Atlantic. So given the differences across the Atlantic and within Europe, how can the US be more involved in facilitating green policy throughout Europe?
Right. So I think I would stress 2 points. The first is that like just sticking with some form of climate ambitions in the US is going to be extremely important, right? I think this is with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other policies that came out of the Biden administration, Europe for the first time had the impression that like the US is serious about fighting climate change. And this is of course also helpful for the domestic discourse in European member states and at the EU level to show that like countries like the US are moving as well, so we better get going, right? So that's the first point. The second point is that I think there are different philosophies in the US and the EU when it comes to climate policy, right? On the one hand, the EU has like more a regulatory stance, stronger focus on carbon pricing, whereas the US, especially under Biden, has like developed this big industrial policy push using a lot of fiscal means. Now, you could say that the EU is trying to become more like the US now with the shift that von der Leyen is trying to orchestrate. But in the end, especially at the EU level, it's going to remain more constrained than what the US is doing, just because the fiscal means in Europe, or at the EU level at least, are going to be more limited than they are in the US. So we need to find a way to reconcile these 2 different approaches. And I think one of the big lessons from the IRA is that we need to think strategically and early on about how to design these kinds of industrial policies in order to make them digestible across the Atlantic, right? So, for example, opening up green subsidy schemes early on to producers in Europe and other allies as well, making sure that we have green trading standards that are similar across the Atlantic and also not discriminate against each other. I think these are the thinking about how to deal with green subsidies in the future under WTO law. All of these are things that I think if we have a constructive partnership between the US and Europe in the next couple of years, that are things that can be hammered out and that would be helpful to consolidate the fact that both countries or both economic blocs are moving towards climate policies on different paths.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to end this great conversation. Thank you so much, Niels, and I hope that we get a chance to speak again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.